The best way to improve a book is to rewrite it. A second draft is always better than a first, a third better than a second. Writing and rewriting a book, what we call drafting, is crucial to a project's success, but one which rarely gets attention. We can talk character arcs and act structure all day, outlining versus discovery, and so forth, but how often do we think about our drafts, our process and purpose for them? Do they simply exist to try the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result, or do they have meaning all on their own? More importantly, how many is too many? How do we know when we're done? I start new drafts with a completely blank page. I take the old version of the project and toss it aside, ignoring everything that came before. That may sound extreme, but there's a method to the madness. When I started writing, I approached new drafts as improvements on the old draft, rather than as a replacement for them. Over time, I discovered this caused the new draft to pass through the same old ruts as the previous one. Improvements were made to prose and pacing, but any core failures of the story would remain. The only way I was able to break free from this was to set out in a completely new direction, forgetting about everything that came before. I now start new drafts with both a blank page and with blank assumptions. Who are my characters? What is this world? Which story are we telling? These are the questions I ask myself when starting a new project, and I make sure to ask them again whenever I start a new draft. Now, admittedly, I often arrive at the same conclusions, but the exercise is an important part of challenging our assumptions, of identifying areas that need improvement. It's like putting armor on the parts of the plane that don't have holes in it. By foregoing all previous assumptions, I'm free to change aspects of the story, even if those elements are crucial pieces of the story's foundation. This can be really challenging to do if you're constantly glancing at the previous draft, attempting to polish something doomed to failure instead of starting from scratch. To give one example, I have this character in Trial of Atlas. He's a reporter named Cobb. I struggled with that character in every draft I wrote. I just couldn't seem to get him right. Relying too heavily on the previous draft would have caused me to waste time polishing a version of the character I didn't like. But by questioning my assumptions and starting with a blank page, I free myself to change basic, fundamental aspects of the character in search of a better story. In each draft, his backstory changed, his personality and outlook on life changed. Sure, every draft had a reporter named Cobb because I needed a reporter and Cobb's as good a name as any, but by starting with no assumptions as to what the story should be, I freed myself to the possibility of what the story could be, mixing and matching features until I found a combination that worked. I do this with every aspect of the narrative. It's not uncommon for me to drop entire chapters between drafts or add new ones. Characters, subplots, even major story arcs can change. The drafting process isn't about getting the previous attempt right. It's about discovering what the story is, each time with a deeper understanding of the material. That's a lot easier to do when starting from a blank canvas rather than trying to add additional layers over an old painting. So how does starting from a blank page each time lead to structure? Doing something over and over again is a process, but not a very orderly one. Wouldn't starting from scratch make it difficult to discern progress, to determine if we're improving at all? This is one of those places where experience comes into play, not just for your writing, but who you are as a writer. For me personally, I tend to write around 5 drafts per project. I don't set out to write 5 drafts, and sometimes I write more and sometimes I write less, but 5 tends to be the right number for me. More importantly, there is a structure to these 5 drafts. I'm not just writing draft 1 5 times. I'm isolating and nailing down important parts of the story with each draft. Those 5 drafts consist of 3 core drafts and 2 polished drafts. each one centered around a specific goal with an increasing amount of the story locked in as each draft progresses. For the 3 core drafts, I begin as we discussed above. Completely blank page, no assumptions. Now, as we talked about in the writing process video, I'm a heavy outliner, and I do use previous drafts as a guide when outlining the next one. I'll also read through the scenes in the previous draft to determine which are working and where and how I want to make improvements to the scenes I'm keeping. Over the years, I have noticed that each of these core drafts have their own focus, even if it's subconscious. I think there's this temptation when we sit down to write that we have to capture the whole story in its entirety the first time. We have to capture everything the story is, was, and will be in this draft as though it were the final product. We have this expectation that we can sit down, write the story out in final form, and then fix it with a little proofreading and editing. I have discovered in my now, almost like 13 years of writing, that I rarely work this way. This is another reason why I start with a completely blank page. It helps me avoid the easy trap of getting caught up in trying to fix prose or pacing when what I should be focused on is plot, character, and other major defects lying beneath the surface. Each of these 3 core drafts centers around a fundamental part of the story. My first draft tends to be heavily targeted towards plot, of making sure the base structural elements are in place. This does have some downsides. Personally, I've always struggled with characters, starting with broad, often one-dimensional characters or archetypes and fleshing them out in later drafts. And I think it's this drafting process that is responsible. It's because in the first draft, I'm not focused on them, I'm focused on the plot. The second draft is then when I do most of the character work. I may start with a blank page, but I'm likely to return to a lot of the conclusions I drew the first time through, including major plot beats and overall story. Major chapters, story arcs, etc. may be jettisoned between the 2 drafts, but the broad strokes, the parts that survive to the second time around, essentially become locked in, allowing me to focus on harder issues like character, fleshing them out and making sure they fit well within the story. By the time I get to a third draft, most of the story beats and characters are locked, the story starting to resemble its ultimate form. Characters, overall chapters, world building, and the like become less likely to change with each subsequent draft. Some chapters can still be moved around, major character arcs shifted in the pacing, but much of the story has become fixed into place. This third draft then focuses on making sure the pacing is where I want it to be. Character arcs flow nicely, and each chapter is to the quality I expect, even if the individual scenes within those chapters are still shaky. Then comes the polishing stage, which usually runs me about 2 drafts. Once I reach the polishing part of the process, the story is effectively content locked. The characters, chapters, major plot points, world building, and so on are unlikely to change from here on out. I still start with a blank page, but I'm no longer asking myself those fundamental questions. Each draft circles tighter and tighter towards the ultimate goal, narrowing in scope and increasing with speed. In the fourth draft, I'm no longer focused on the broader elements, and instead start to focus on making the story the best possible version of itself it can be. I'm no longer worried about where a chapter should go or if that chapter is good enough. Instead, I'm focusing on scenes within the chapter rather than the chapter themselves. Anything within a scene is fair game to be changed or tossed out as needed, but the overall beats of the scene and the positioning within the story are pretty static by this point. Thus, some of the material you read in the so-called final copy may actually be first pass, no different than a first draft. The quality, however, is drastically improved because we've spent each preceding draft getting more and more experience with the story. The final acts of proofreading and editing smooth out the cracks, so the reader doesn't notice which parts are new and which parts have been there since the actual first draft. The fifth and hopefully final draft is where the spit and shine is applied. By this point, everything except the prose is locked in place. This draft only serves as a chance to polish each line, to punch up the prose, fix typos, and correct editing mistakes along the way. If this process sounds familiar to you, that's probably because you're picking up on the parallels between how I write and how video games are made. Thanks largely to marketing, the general public are familiar with a game being an alpha or beta. While these terms have largely been co-opted by marketing, their original meaning is still important to development and relevant to how we approach our writing. A video game has reached alpha when it is feature complete. So for, say, Mario, that means there's a character and that character can jump, and there are enemies and they can be jumped on. It means there are levels and power-ups, a start menu, and a game over screen. A game reaches beta when it is asset complete. Assets are things like Mario's sprite, the jumping animation, sound effects, music, and all the other elements that make a game feel alive. Alpha is about features and functionality, beta is about appearance and presentation. After beta, a game will go through a cycle of quality assurance, revisions, and bug fixes before finally going gold. This is when the game is published, so named because of these things called CDs that used to exist. The parallels to my drafting process is pretty plain. My 3 core drafts are when I'm working towards alpha, putting in the features of characters, plot points, and so on, in the same way developers make levels and populate them with enemies. The 2 polished drafts are me working towards beta and eventual release. The assets get locked down, the bugs get fixed, until I feel the project has reached its final state and is ready for release. By now, hopefully the process is clear, even if the number is not. I can't simply write 5 drafts and expect to get the desired result. The process is important. It provides structure and stability to the project, but the process can only lead to a result. It can't make it. So how do we determine when the project is done? How can we tell how many drafts is enough? For me, it comes down to one of 2 terminal states. I know a project is finished because I'm either satisfied with the thing I've made, or I'm completely blind to it. Satisfaction has nothing to do with quality or perfection. It's a subjective determination that can only be made by you, the writer, and can be affected by everything from time spent on the project to competing priorities or deadlines. Both Rebuilding the Executive and Thrice Dead Witch are far from perfect. I knew I was finished with them not because I reached some ideal state of narrative ascension, but because I read through the draft and said, for better or worse, this is the book I set out to write. Sure, I could spend another 2 years polishing and refining the manuscript over and over again, but the cliff of diminishing returns is a sharp one, and I have more books to write. Trial of Atlas, on the other hand, was a different story. I wrote like 6 or 7 drafts of that thing because I was never really satisfied with it. So why did I put it out when I did? It's because at a certain point, with so many competing drafts in my head, having spent so much time with the story, I became nose blind to it. You know how you don't know what you smell like, or how you can sit at home all day not realizing anything's amiss, but run out to the store or see a movie and detect some funky smell immediately upon walking in the door? Well, the same thing happened to me with that book. I could sit down and read it and have no response one way or another. I was just used to it, like saying the same word over and over again until it's lost all meaning. Now, generally when this happens, we put the book down. We step away from it for a while, even work on another project. But I took months off in between drafts of Trial of Atlas, working on Rebuilding the Executive and some other projects. And when I came back to it, I was still noseblind. I reached a place where I simply couldn't think about the story anymore, and time wasn't going to fix it. So I put it out. To sum everything up, I typically write 5 drafts per project, 3 core and 2 polish. Sometimes I write more core drafts and sometimes less, depending on how happy I am with the result. Each draft has a focused goal, with the drafts building off the work that came before it, while still being free to change major aspects as needed. Each draft content locks more and more of the story until I feel satisfied enough that I can move into polishing the prose and fixing any typos. And I put the book out either when I'm happy with the thing I've made or become so numb that I can't think about it anymore. As a writer, you should be constantly evaluating and re-evaluating your process, from how you structure and outline a story to how you approach each draft. It is absolutely vital to think about characters and act structures and all the other parts of storytelling. But your process can be just as much a part of the puzzle. The better we get at refining our skills, the easier those next stories are going to be to write. I'm Mike Laguero. Thanks for watching. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by picking up one of the books I mentioned in this video. Trial of Atlas is a psychological thriller according to Amazon's algorithm. Rebuilding the Executive is a behind-the-curtain peek at the day-to-day functions of the executive branch. And Thrice Dead Witch is a fun sword and sorcery tale set in the universe of an epic fantasy I'm working on. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Assumptions. Assumptions. It's not leviosa. Challenging are mixing and maxing features until I found matching personality and quality of that. It's about destroying. Does something. Nope.
Was ist Draft Progress? What's all this?
And I think this drafting process at chapter anything within a anything feature complete, right? Animation to exist. Got right to the end and it up. Beta is a I was not recording. It makes me sad.
Time for break. Change.
Mine provides. What the No, what happened? What happened here? Can only be blah 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 blah. Releasing the book out.